Welcome to the Wanderers Podcast, and thank you for listening. If you enjoy our podcast, please like, rate, and subscribe.
Hi, welcome to the Wanderers Podcast. We are continuing our story of the life of Jesus. And today we have with us Sejana. She's joining our panel. So, Sejana, will you introduce yourself and tell people who you are?
Thanks, Roy. Roy is my pastor. I actually go to Impact Temple Church. And my name is Sejana. I live here in Temple, Texas. I'm a mom, I'm a wife. I serve as a hospital chaplain and as a spiritual director, and I preach pulpit supply. I also do some things online with people, and you can learn more about me on SejanaShines.com. I'm happy to be here today.
We're glad you're here.
Yeah, we're excited. As I've gotten to know Sejana, I've always valued your perspective, especially when we're reading scripture. Because you're always bringing new things, and I'm excited to hear how, we're all reading when we read this story that we're going to be into today, and that is the triumphal entry. We're finally getting into that. This is sort of the beginning of that last week of Jesus' life, and it begins with this triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So I'm going to kick us off with Matthew chapter 21, and I'm going to read 1 through 11, and we're going to read this in all three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I'm going to start in Matthew chapter 21, and we're going to be reading from verse 1 through 11. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "See to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their coats on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven." When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee."
Want me to read Mark now? Okay. All right, I'll read Mark 11, 1 through 11. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord needs it, and will send it here shortly.'" They went and found a colt outside in the street, tied at a doorway. As they untied it, some people standing there asked, "What are you doing, untying that colt?" They answered as Jesus had told them to, and the people let them go. When they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks over it, he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the ground, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12.
Thank you. And I will be reading from Luke 19, starting in verse 28. After Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' say, 'The Lord needs it.'" Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. And as they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" And they replied, "The Lord needs it." So they brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. And as he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the road goes down to the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he replied, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side, and they will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." Okay, initial thoughts. Feel like we're culminating so much of what we've talked about on this podcast, and here he is. He's entering Jerusalem now.
Entering Jerusalem in a very key way. There in the Gospels, like up to this point, there's been some what we call like the messianic secret. Like people, some people recognize him, some aren't. He's done miracles and told people not to tell people. Like he's not ready to for everybody to acknowledge that he is the coming Messiah. Not anymore. Like he's coming into Jerusalem intentionally, drawing from all of this king imagery, some prophetic imagery. I am here.
What are your initial thoughts, Sejana?
Yeah, I don't have anything really to add. There are some specific things that they're doing here that I guess we'll probably talk about and unpack, So yeah, I'm happy to see how this conversation unfolds.
Yeah. So one of the things I had looked up and found in commentaries was the history behind the laying of branches and things like that, and just the question of why would they do this? What's going on here? Like, what am I as a white American not understanding the context of what's going on? Why branches? Why cloaks? What's going on? And so one of the things I found was, so in First Maccabees, which is kind of a history of the Jews, and I would say in that in-between time between the Old and New Testaments. So this happened about 200 years before this time. Jerusalem had been captured by a man named Antiochus Epiphanes around 175 BC. And he basically came in and wanted to erase Judaism and make the region a Palestine Greek culture. So he goes into their temple, desecrates it. He puts pig flesh on the altar, makes all kinds of sacrifices to Zeus, the Greek god. And he even turned their temple chambers into public brothels. So while that's going on, the Maccabees, this group of Jewish people, decided to revolt and rescue their land. And they do. And they gain it back. And so in that, they restored the temple, took down all the symbols of Zeus, and purified and rededicated the temple back to God. It was in that rededication that they lit a menorah The menorah only had oil for one day. They say it miraculously burned for 8 days, which is why to this day they celebrate Hanukkah. It was from that restoration of the temple. Hanukkah actually means dedication in Hebrew. And in the writing of this history, in 2 Maccabees 10:7, it says, "Therefore they bare branches and fair boughs and palms, and also sang psalms unto him that had given them good success in cleansing his place." So it's interesting to me, knowing that history, knowing that all of the Jews would have been well aware of that, Jesus included, specifically knowing right after this is Jesus getting really angry in the temple and cleansing it, so to speak, but also just this broader picture of him coming to cleanse it. But I think I'm so struck specifically in this story that he was there and it's all culminating and we can see that big picture. But at the same time, I still think he was doing it in an unexpected way. I think they were expecting a king to come in and revolt, destroy, almost like a Maccabean revolt against Rome. And yet Jesus is coming peacefully on a donkey. That in of itself, around, especially in Old Testament times and times of the prophets, if a king came on a donkey, it meant peace. And if he came on a horse, it meant war. So I don't know that it was always like we see donkeys now and think kind of they're ridiculous and it's like an embarrassment and shame. That could have been going on, but I think more for them in their Middle Eastern eyes, it was the sign of a king coming in peace, which I think goes so much more with Jesus and what he came to do. So the biggest, I guess, takeaway I see here is a king coming on peace in a surprising way, but also in a way that's reminding them of their own Jewish history, and I think would have been causing a lot in that crowd who are laying down branches to ask, wait, like, is there going to be a cleansing? How is this happening? What's going on? Is it Rome? Is it our own leaders?
It's interesting that, like, even if he's coming in a way that's announcing a kind of peace, the crowd, they may have different expectations of that, but even just the fact that he is acknowledging himself as the son of David and therefore the Messiah, that's enough to threaten people. And that's, so you see in Luke especially, like, the leaders, immediately hating this and immediately, like, telling the disciples, you're going to stop him from doing what he's doing. And then that's going to just lead into a series of events that's going to culminate in the crucifixion. People in power do not, even if somebody is coming in a posture of peace and goodness and of God, if it's threatening their power, there's going to be a reaction to that. Power desires to stay in power.
Which is ironic, considering Jesus had all the power in the world and gave it up. Just the juxtaposition of the power that he held, and yet willingly came in humility and humbled himself. It's quite different.
Yeah, Roy was talking about power. Well, Roy brought up power, but you, Karen, talked about the donkey being, today for us here in America, usually it's associated with embarrassment and shame. And yet that was the animal that Jesus chose to come into the city on. And I just thought about, for a person that has power or could have power for us here, what would it feel like for a person who could say something or could do something and chooses not to? Could it be I wonder what it would be like for a person to humble themselves in such a way that they would, I guess I'm just thinking about what it would be like for us to humble ourselves and to ride that donkey.
Yeah, I've been thinking there have been some things going on that have kind of had me thinking about just about power in general. And like, uh, we inaugurate a new president. Like, okay, so, we've seen over the last couple of weeks, the trappings of American power and the trappings of our political power, through, pomp and ceremony. Um, there, when we see a person, take and receive the ability to do a whole lot of things and choose to act in ways that are not self-serving. Uh, and it strikes us as, I don't know, it strikes me like that would be remarkable. We could not to expect that. And I think that's that worldly power that we see that are at work in the Gospels, in the people who are holding positions of power, like Herod, like the temple authorities, like the Sadducees, where Jesus, who has all power and all authority, finally reveals that that's the truth of who he is. And yet the whole time he has been discipling those who've been following him in what real leadership looks like. The Gentiles, the rulers of the Gentiles, they lord it over them. That's who you are. If you want to be first in the kingdom, you're going to be last. If you want to be great, you're going to be a servant. If you want to be great in the kingdom, you're going to have to learn how to be a slave to those whom you are serving. And then Jesus, I think, demonstrates that over the next weeks.
This is going to date me, but I remember when I was in late high school, there was a popular Christian singer named Rich Mullins, and he was known for being very different than other Christian artists. He lived on a Native American village, kind of as a missionary, lived very poor. But the story that has always stuck with me about him, that particular year, he was up for I don't remember if it was like Dove Awards or some Christian music, something like Artist of the Year. And the story was that in this scene where there's this huge room, Dove Awards, all these tables of famous Christian singers, that he knew he was up, and instead of sitting at the table receiving honor, he had gone to the kitchen and changed clothes with one of the servers. And they realized at the end of the night that he was there, but he was serving all of them, and nobody had recognized him up until that point. And it's just always stuck with me because I think that's so like what Jesus would do. In serving that way, not making a big scene, but just the humility that he, in that moment, deserved a lot of praise and accolations, and instead saw it as an opportunity just to serve those around him. And I think you're right, Roy, like it's such I think those of us that know Jesus well are just longing for more of that upside down kingdom and long to see that in our society around us. More humility, I think, would be helpful. One of the things that I think really spoke to me too in the Luke passage, when the Pharisees get on to Jesus and, are like, tell him to be quiet. It's kind of that, who do you think you are? Which I think actually echoes somewhat back to the garden. And Jesus responds and says, even the stones will cry out. as I was reading about that specifically, it was like it could be just any stone, but it could also be like these stones of the temple right here will cry out. And so that started making me think, I guess, a lot of just using my theological imagination in what would that look like for stones to cry out? What, I realize it's a metaphor and a symbolism, kind of this anthropomorphic idea of stones speaking. What struck me, considering all that's gone on in America right now too, is the feeling that even if they don't praise me and cry out, these stones will. Now, whether or not actual stones will cry out, like I think God's capable of making that happen, but I have no idea what that would exactly look like. But I was really specifically struck by the movement of the Spirit, where you cannot contain it, that even stones would speak a better word and speak a louder word. And I think when I read that, it just really struck me of how much I personally feel that as a female, that has pursued places of ministry and often been kind of shut down of who do you think you are? And Jesus rebuked her. Like, who does she think she is talking about you like that and proclaiming that? And just the feeling in my gut, though, that I can't help it. I feel like those stones, like I cannot keep quiet and I cannot stop talking about him. And I don't know, just this, it struck me so much, I guess, just in the story, weirdly empathizing with stones of like, I know that feeling. I know what that feels like to not be able to keep quiet. But also I know what it feels like to have others in leadership say, who do you think you are? Like, tell her to be quiet. And Jesus's defense in that moment of like, no, this is good and this is right. It just struck me of how different my life might be if others in leadership around had, instead of said, rebuking and be quiet, said, what does she have to say? Or what are these, what is this perspective over here? Anyway, it's kind of a weird tangent, but something I really felt in reading this passage.
Yeah, I as also a female in ministry, I can relate to that. So I appreciate you tying that together there. And I just want to lift up also, I've seen people who've been in ministry a long time or older persons, who will sort of squash the words of youth, of young people who have something to say, who have something that God has given them. So I think of, out of the mouth of babes, maybe we, if we were to listen, we can hear what God might be saying through others. So if you're a youth listening, let no one despise you because of your youth. God may speak through anyone and anything. As it's here, even the stones can cry out to proclaim my glory. So just uplifting young people who are being used as well by the Lord and God's Spirit today.
Yeah, I love that. I totally agree. If he can use stones, how much more can he use an image bearer? Somebody that is literally made in his image where the stones are not. So, yes, I love that.
You said something about like these stones being probably the typical stones, and Luke is doing something. Luke is bringing a perspective that the other gospels don't have. They don't have this speech that Jesus makes, nor do they have the fact here that Jesus In this moment, it says he approached Jerusalem, he sees the city, he weeps over it, and he talks about he starts to talk about the temple. And I want to just give a little bit of a historical perspective. Luke Luke is probably writing sometime after 70 AD. I know that's quite a bit later than Jesus' resurrection. What happens is that the the people of Judea, the Jewish people, you were talking about the Maccabees, well, they rise up again, and the Romans get fed up, and so a Roman general comes into Jerusalem, wipes it out. I mean, just obliterates the place and destroys the temple. And that's the end. And Herod's temple was incredible. I mean, it was this gorgeous, huge, expensive building. Then wipe it out completely. So Antiochus Epiphanes in the Maccabean period, he defiled it. Pompey just obliterates it.
And Pompey was in 70 AD, right?
Yeah. And so, if what Jesus is seeking here is he's seeing a people who should be embracing Jesus as the Messiah, Jesus as the answer. To follow in the way of Jesus is going to be following him in a path that leads to peace. It is that path of love. It is that path of compassion, of radical grace, where God's goodness extends not just to the people of Israel, but actually to the whole world, where enemies become reconciled to each other. And we see that happening in the early church. That the early church is living a life together that is bound up in the peace of Jesus, where enemies are becoming friends, where slave owners and their slaves redefine their relationship as brothers and sisters. It's a radical thing happening in these Christian communities. Jesus is seeing the city that should be embracing him in that, rejecting him. And he knows they're going to reject him. He knows what's coming. And he also knows that when they're going to follow that path, that desire for an earthly king, for military might, for the restoration of their earthly kingdom, it's going to lead to this war. And he's looking at a temple that he knows in 40 years is not going to exist anymore. And I think that's what he's speaking about. I think that's why he's weeping. Because he knows he loves these people. He loves this city. And he knows that not only are they going to reject him, but they're going to continue down the path of destruction that is going to lead to the destruction of this city. And it breaks his heart. And yes.
I'm struck by that too, it not only leads to the destruction of the city, but to the very lives of Jesus's followers, that almost all of the men die as martyrs. And even just thinking about the early church and how many martyrs there were in that early church, but that same peaceful spirit that Jesus came with, like a quiet defiance of the current leadership and of who he would bow down to, but always done in humility. And just, I don't know, it just struck me thinking about all of the early church martyrs that we learned about in seminary, and so many of them had just this spirit of humility and peace, and they weren't necessarily out there screaming at Caesar. They were often living quiet lives, but lives of defiance, and lives that said, no, this is my king. It's not about glory or positions of power or things like that, but it's about serving and being lowly. And yet they were still killed for it in the end. So I don't know. I'm wondering if some of those hearers of Jesus absolutely were for the city of Jerusalem and knowing that it would fall again. And all of this tied from history of you're literally doing the same thing of welcoming me from previously 200 years before in this cleansing of the temple, but it's going to fall again. But there is a different way, and I don't know, that speaks a lot to even First Corinthians and our bodies are a temple, and the way Hebrews describes Jesus. It's such an opening of the kingdom of where he is and where he moves, where we can worship, and our very lives being a sacrifice just like him.
When the thoughts that come to my mind when thinking about Jesus pausing and weeping over the city, and then the words that come next in Luke, if you had only known on this day, blah, blah, blah. And it ends with in verse 44, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. That whole 3 verses there after Jesus weeps for this over the city, I think of, I read that with the eyes of a parent, a loving parent, one that cares for your children, and you see the way in which they're going, and you know where it's headed, and you say, if only you would listen to me, if only you would follow my ways, like I'm trying to help you and you don't even see it. And it's the sadness there and knowing like where their direction is, where they're headed. That's what I think about here. And I know that I think also when I was a youth, living in the house, I thought my ways were right, like I knew what I knew. But now that I'm older and I look back, I only knew partially. I didn't know the whole thing. And even now I don't know all things, but I can operate as if I know all there is to know. And so I'm going to move forward. But Jesus is saying there's more happening here.
Mm-hmm.
If only
I
you
love
would pay
that.
attention.
Yeah, I love how you're pointing out the compassion of God, that it's, I think those words could be construed to be like he's wrathful and he's angry. Not exactly sure what he was feeling, but I love how you point out when you think of it like a parent, I don't feel that way towards my kids. It's more of a heartbroken, which tracks with his tears and the weeping of I longing for them to have eyes that are open or to make, a better choice in whatever situation. So on that note, one of the things we are trying to do, Sejana, on this podcast is when we're looking at a passage is always ask, how does this passage help me love God better? If that is one of our ultimate goals in reading scripture. And so taking that view of seeing that passage, maybe like a parent, how does that help you love God?
I think just sticking with the Luke passage in verse 44, it really does. It says, because you do not recognize the time of God coming to you. So a prayer for me is that I would recognize what God is doing in my life and in the lives of those around me, what's happening, that I would pay attention. I can get so busy that I don't notice what's happening, what's going on. Or I can have my own idea and only see that way and not recognize all the things that are happening here. They had ideas they might have had ideas as you brought out with Second Maccabees. They might have had a thought in their mind of how I know where this is going, but they didn't. But they didn't recognize that God was right there among them and where maybe God was leading them, what God was drawing them to. So for me, reading these passages again and having this discussion with you too. Um, Kind of broadens it a little more to consider what else God may be doing that I might be overlooking. I want to pay attention.
I love that. Roy, what about you? How does this passage help you love God?
Well, the scene here is a group of people who are standing at the gate and hailing their king. My king, this is my king. He is not just the king of these people, he is the king of the very rocks and the dirt and the trees and all of creation. That if they needed to, we would hear their voice worshiping him. And he is the king who, over and over, we've been reading stories of his compassion, his mercy, in ways that were unexpected and sometimes antisocial, according to their customs. And he is the king who is going to be willingly submitting himself to a humiliating crucifixion. That is my king. And that is who I worship and who I and to form my life around. And there are a million alternatives to what power should look like, the way I should live my life, what we should pursue, who we should love, and who we should hate. Jesus is my king. And so this passage is just really clarifying that for me, that, man, all of these other people cannot tell me how to live my life, and Jesus can.
Yeah. I love that. As I was myself just kind of thinking through, what do I see in Jesus in this passage? I see Jesus was courageous. I was reminded in John, I think it talks about when the chief and the Pharisees, the chief priests and the Pharisees found out where Jesus was, they said to anybody, basically report it so that they can arrest him. So in the sense, like, he had a bounty on his head and he's walking into Jerusalem when he could have snuck in. And instead he's coming on that donkey, representing that he's coming in peace, but as a king still, which I just am so struck by that combination, and how it is so unlike so many leaders that we see today. I see Jesus is showing by that he is the anointed one coming in love. One of the quotes that I had found in William Barclay's commentary, it's talking about this, and it said it was Jesus's last appeal. In this action, Jesus came, as it were, with pleading hands that were outstretched, saying, "Even now, will you take me as your king?" And before the hatred of men engulfed him, once again he confronted men with love as his last invitation. And that, it struck me so much of yes. Like, Jesus has consistently been a humble servant that is saying, I'm coming in peace. I am coming in love for everyone. I will not play power games. I will not put myself above as this ruler and tyrant, and instead he's coming in humility and love. I specifically love this scene. I was thinking too about how so there's a lot of prophets' voices that we haven't really tied in, of Jeremiah and things that tie into leading, that should have opened their eyes to say, oh, this might be the one coming. But in the prophets, so often we see the prophets in the Old Testament, they would speak words and they would not be heard. The people of Israel were not listening. And often they were resorted to taking really strong actions to, okay, now that you won't listen to my words, now I'm going to physically show you a way. And it's almost, as an artist, it struck me, I thought, it's actually kind of like performance art. And there's a lot of like modern day performance art that can really make me feel uncomfortable. Like, oh, this is kind of cringy. I don't love it. But it can also really make us think in new ways. And I thought, in some sense, this is what Jesus is doing. He's been speaking, he's been healing, and he's doing all of these things. But as a king, this is an amazing act of performance that is like, now I will show you how I'm coming in peace, and I am not coming to overthrow Rome. I am coming in a far different way, and you haven't really listened to all that I've been saying, and so now I'm going to show you. And this is one of those first acts that he is actually going to show what that means, in his humility in that. So on that note, if we follow a king who is humble and coming in peace, one of the other questions we want to ask is, how does this help us love our neighbor? And so how would you guys answer that? If that's the king that we follow and we want to be like them, how does this passage help us love our neighbor better?
I guess this isn't really what we've been talking about, but as I was reading these passages before, it was a little thing, but it occurred to me that the cult that was requested, and used, it was probably owned by somebody. There were people watching it somehow because they asked, "What are you doing?" Um, and yet they let them take it to go use it. We need it, and then they let them take it. So it's small, but I was thinking about, well, they shared what they had. I don't know if they knew who Jesus was to say, "Oh, okay." I know they said the Lord needs it, but I just think about today. Do we share what we have? As small or as big as it might be, as important as it might be to us, or not important. I mean, it was tied outside. I mean, was it important to them? I don't know, but maybe it was, and that's why they asked, "What are you doing?" But they let it go. I don't know why they let it go, but they did. And I just think about the things that I have, things, gifts, talents, uh, um, possessions, ideas. What do I have that I could share so that it could be used by others for the Lord? Could that be a help to my neighbor? I don't know what God is doing. They didn't know what was going to happen with the cult. They didn't explain everything. They just asked for it. And maybe if I were to think about everything that I have and all that I have access to, and privilege for, could I offer it up to my neighbor because maybe the Lord has need of it in some way? And it might not even be through me. It might be through that person. They would take it and use it and do good things. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the old joke there is, if he can use this donkey, maybe he can use a jackass like me. You know, for the thousand. In fact, I almost preached that one time, and my wife said, "Yeah, you probably shouldn't say that." So I said on the podcast, uh, yeah, I love that idea, Sejana, that here's what I got. God, use it for something. Um, the my answer to that question, I wouldn't think about that, Sejana. So thank you. Um, if the rocks, if even the stones cry out, that image has just really kind of captured my brain. Is that like the right ordering of creation is worship, like bowing down to Jesus is just the right way that we live into our creation, our who we have been created to be. The whole world will bow down to Jesus joyfully. And so maybe my way of loving a neighbor well is to help them worship the Lord for their sake, because that's who they've been created to be. That's what's good for them. It's right for them to be in that relationship. And so to join me in saying Hosanna in the highest. And that's, man, I hate to be cheesy enough to say like, oh, my way of loving my neighbor is to invite them to church. Except that maybe my way of loving my neighbor is to invite them to church, or to invite them into knowing who Jesus is and into that relationship with him.
Mm. I think for me, in just thinking, how does this help me love my neighbor? You mentioned, Roy, of just some events that have happened this last week with the inauguration, and I have been so struck and moved by the bishop, I think Bude, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, that preached at the prayer service. And I've listened a couple of times to the whole sermon. And there is, I know she's caught a lot of flack for that. But when I've gone back and listened and combed through it, and I thought there is nothing that I have found that I disagree with, in that it is ultimately a plea for upside down kingdom living, and a plea for mercy and love and peace. And I realize that gets complicated, and we can disagree on immigration and all kinds of different things like that. But ultimately, we have a king that is calling us to love and to be at peace with each other, but a king that calls us to speak up for the least of these. And just like in the scene, especially in Luke, that is incredibly offensive to those who hold power. And yet we have a king that continues to give up his power. We saw that. We talked about this on the podcast in the very first temptation that Jesus had on the mountain, and Satan's tempting him with power. I think he knew, as a human, this is going to be your number one thing. And if I can get you to do this, then I'll have you. And Jesus, we see him as God and King that continually gives that up, even in this scene, in the sense that he's riding a donkey on peace. Mm-hmm. And he comes to bring this upside down kingdom where not only do we serve a king who does that, but we serve a king that is asking us to do the same, and is asking us to give up our positions of power, to love other people, to have mercy on those who need it, and to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And I think ultimately this story just reminds me of that, and not that I am a king, or I am a woman that deeply struggles with trying to live like Jesus, and I'm not perfect in that, but I want to be known for humility like that, and I want to be known for seeing the least of these and bringing them into the kingdom like him.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, may it be so.
Yeah.
May it be so.
Well, friends, thank you for joining us on this podcast. This is just the first podcast, the first episode that's leading into what we call Holy Week. I'm excited. I'm a little bit nervous as we flood through this week for the next few weeks, leading into the crucifixion, the resurrection, which we'll be covering. We'll be dropping pretty close to Easter, and so things are just lining up that way. So thank you for joining us. We thank you to our producer Bobby, and we hope you'll join us next week.
We have some new social media channels, so come find us on Facebook, and we are on Spotify and podcast and YouTube. So please look us up and subscribe there. It will help us reach more people. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wanderers Podcast, a production of Red Cord Media. For more information on this and other podcasts, please visit redcordmedia.org.